I've run a lot of Bible studies in my life, and this is one of those texts that when people are just sort of reading it on their own or maybe in a small group, it is so easy to go down a really dark and scary reading of the text. The dark and scary reading that many of us may have either assumed to be true or been even taught to be true is this idea that this is sort of a wheat to the chaff sort of a text, right? That we're going to go ahead and, you lob off the dead branches and you set them on fire and that the fire is hell, right? Like this is sort of the assumption I think a lot of people make when they read this. But this is not remotely true. It's not at all what the text is actually about. It's not about saying worthless branches, you're going into the fire, and good branches, you bear much fruit, right? It isn't about that at all. It's about something way more important. Because you got to remember that Christianity is not really about the afterlife as much as it's about what we do with this life. God has solved the afterlife. We are here to deal with this life. And so whenever we read a text, we should always ask, what does this have to do with this life? Then we can ask the other question later. When you start doing that, you come up with a really profound approach to life. To get to that, we got to back up a few things and talk about gardening. Because that's the analogy after all, right? Who here is a gardener? Raise your hand. Anyone? Anyone? We got a few people willing to admit it. All right. So gardeners out there, since there's a chunk of y'all, what is something you need to do for a fruit-bearing plant on a regular basis? Like, let's say, yearly? Prune it. Who said that? Up there. All right. I couldn't quite tell where the voice came from. That is absolutely true. One of the biggest mistakes you can make as like a novice gardener is be like, well, I'm going to plant this thing and just let it grow. Because what comes out the first year is probably not going to be produced by that same thing next year. You need to prune it, or the plant is going to put all its energy into something that's already sort of dead, if not completely dead. So if you're dealing with any fruit bush, fruit vine, pretty much anything that bears fruit, you need to prune it on some sort of regular basis. And obviously, depending on what it is, it might be yearly, it might be twice a year, it might be more than that, right? This is just how fruit works. You don't prune, it doesn't produce a lot of fruit, and ultimately can overgrow and inwardly collapse and die, right? This is true of our spiritual lives. This is true not just as individuals, it's true as a community. Is that this pruning that they're talking about isn't this violent, horrible, awful act. It isn't about throwing things into a fiery furnace of burning. It's about the natural course of life and change, either individually or communally. Let me give you some examples. As you all know, I used to help people do finances before I became a pastor. And one of the things I actually highly recommend, and I will recommend in front of all of y'all today, that you should all do when you get home. If you take nothing else from the sermon, do this. Go home, look at your credit card statement. I'm pretty sure all of us use credit cards, right? Look at your credit card statement, and I'd say pull the end of each quarter plus December. Okay? Look at the credit card statement. And you may be asking, why should I do that? It is not to judge how much you're spending. That's a whole different conversation. It's not to say this is good or bad or whatever. What I want you to do is see if you're still being charged $70 a month by Norton since 1994. You laugh because a whole bunch of you had that moment. Or McAfee. Or something else that is not particularly usable these days. Or how many of you have went ahead and pay a gym fee to a gym that does not exist in Pennsylvania? How many of you all out there are paying for some sort of streaming service and you're thinking to yourself, oh yeah, I signed up for a 14-day free trial, but they wanted my credit card and I forgot to cancel that. But I got done watching whatever it is you got it to watch. I said, do this afternoon. It's really easy. Just go down. Don't judge yourself on what you're buying, and just say, does this make any sense? Okay? Because I'm going to tell you that most people, if they do that, will find $10, $20 a month that they're spending on something they don't even realize they're spending it on. That is financial pruning. And just like in real pruning, if you find that 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever dollars you're spending every month, you could probably devote that to something else that would make you happier. You could save it. You could invest it. You could buy more lattes. Doesn't really matter, but it will bring you more joy than something you don't even know you're spending your money on, right? You give it to the church. There's my stewardship plug, okay? That's the thing. You do that with finance. You can do that with your time, by the way. If you ask someone to do something, 90% of the time, as someone who works with volunteers, you will get the rightful, legitimate pushback of, I would love to, however, I don't have enough time in the day. Because I'll tell you, I don't care if you're retired, not retired, young, old, whatever, you probably don't feel that you have enough time in the day. In fact, if you poll Americans, like 95% of people will say, yeah, I don't have enough time in the day to do everything I want to do. Right? We all feel that way. If you don't, God bless you. Tell me what your trick is. Okay? And that means our reality is all our time is filled with something. Which means if we're going to listen to God and if we're going to pursue our passions and if we're going to go out there and do something, we got to ditch something first. It means you got to prune your schedules. You got to decide, like, this is not giving me life. This is not helping me out. This is not leading me towards what Christ wants or happiness or whatever you're pursuing. You got to cut that out. Not because it's bad, not because it's evil, not because it's awful, but if it isn't part of what you're called to do, you got to get rid of those things so that you have the capacity to then pursue whatever it is you're trying to pursue, right? It's just sort of the logic of math. This is true of your time. This is true of your money. This is true of your emotional energy, executive function, whatever thing you want to run through. We're all out of all the things. I mean, me and my wife will talk about, hey, do you have time to talk about this? I'll say, I have time, but I'm out of spoons. In other words, I just don't have a clue what else I can handle. So can this wait? I'm betting most of us are out of spoons on any given day. And so what you need to do is figure out what's taking your spoons, what's taking whatever energy is low, and then just ask yourself, is it worth it? And maybe it is, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's like a subscription to Norton going back to 1994. This is true in communities also. Just like you have to prune in your life to grow yourself spiritually, communities have to prune to grow themselves. Now, the minute you say this, you can almost feel the anxiety in a room go up. Because everyone's like, are you pruning me next? Are you pruning my ministry next? Are you pruning the thing I love next? Right? It's always taken as this like act of violence of some sort. Like there's a giant God clippers coming your way. But that's not what I'm talking about. Let me give you a story of probably the most successful pruning I have ever been part of. To do this, we got to go all the way back to Nebraska. I had this group of older women who had a potluck. This potluck started in 1929. It happened every year on Christmas Eve. Yes, December 23rd. They had a potluck. Now, in 1929, when they first did it, they came to me and they said, hey, we aren't getting anyone to come to this. No one but the cooks are coming. Like, literally everyone who comes brought a dish, which is sort of the definition of potluck, but they're like, it didn't used to be this way. We used to get the whole town. We used to get like 2,000 people. Like 2,000 people would show up to this potluck. It was amazing. It wasn't just for the church. It was every church in the town. And every person in town just about showed up. People out in the country would drive in. We'd have this giant potluck on the 23rd. It was this beautiful moment as a community where we all came together, sat around tables. Didn't matter what your background was. Didn't matter if you went to church. Didn't matter what church you went to. You just sat and you ate and you were in fellowship and it was beautiful. And now it's just the 12 of us. And this is killing us. And I said, the last thing they wanted me to say, which is, do you think it's time to end it? And they told me emphatically, no. It's time for you to fix it. I said, okay. Do you think it could be the food? And they looked at me and they said, we thought about that and you're wrong. Okay. And I said, how do you know that I'm wrong? And they said, well, because we've served the exact same thing since 1929. And it worked then. And I'm like, the exact same thing? And then they pulled out the 1929 list of exactly what they made. And then they showed me that this family makes this family makes this family makes this family makes this, and that it had gone that way from mother to daughter through the generations since 1929, so that literally the exact same casserole from the exact same family every single year would show up. I was like, wow, I'm outmatched here. Time to change strategies. I said, do you think what it meant in 1929 maybe is felt differently now? They said, well, what do you mean, Pastor? And I said, well, the amount of sacrifice that's going into this thing is much less now than it was probably in 1929. And they went, what do you mean? It's the same ingredients, same cooking, same hours, same families. How could it be any less? I said, well, food costs less. I mean, what do you mean? And I said, give me all the ingredients, give me all the recipes. I know you have them if you know exactly who's cooking what. They're like, oh yeah, we have that. Give me it from 1929 on. And I'm going to go back and I'm going to look up every ingredient that needs to be looked at to create this exact meal, and we're going to index that sucker to inflation. Turns out when you index it to inflation, in modern day terms, at least a decade ago, so I don't know what it would be now, it was somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 spent on that meal. Because they had meat in every single casserole. And in 1929, only the rich had meat. So I knew a guy in the same area. He sells, let's go with bull specimens. Don't ask more questions or I will answer them. And he sells them at an auction. And before his auction, he would have this extravagant meal for everyone who was going to bid. And he would have an open bar as part of his brilliance. He'd have an open bar for all the people who were about to bid. And he'd feed them all prime rib. All you can eat, legitimately. He killed a cow. He's a rancher. Like yesterday, prime rib. And any other high-level cut of meat you want. And you could just sit there and pile steaks on your plate and you eat it with maybe a potato. This is like the most Nebraskan thing I've ever seen. Okay? And you could eat whatever you wanted. So I went to him and I said, hey, out of curiosity, I got invited to this once. Wonderful food, by the way. How much does that cost you? And I learned that it was costing him, even though he had folks who made it and he slaughtered his own animals, $8,000 to $10,000. Guess what? Everyone in town wanted a ticket to this thing because it was by invite only, because it was amazing. I only swung a ticket once. Here's the thing. If they had offered that food to everyone in the greater Bertrand area, they would have had 1,000 to 2,000 people show up. So I said, so you could totally do it. It would totally work. You just need to raise $8,000 to $10,000. They looked at me and were like, yeah, that's impossible. And I went, no, it's not impossible. You guys figure it out. They said, Pastor, seriously? And I'm like, I don't know about you. I don't think it's the best use of our money to throw a $10,000 party. And they're like, well, we agree. I'm like, why don't you think it's the best use of our money? And I said, well, people enjoy food and fellowship's important. Lots of ways to do fellowship. I said, well, do you think what you guys did in 1929 was wrong? They said, absolutely not. I said, I agree with you on that too. They said, what do you mean? I was like, think about it, guys. What's 1929? Who here knows finance history? What happens in 29? The crash. What goes with the crash if you're in the Midwest? Anyone know that? Poverty. The crash, the Dust Bowl, folks. Y'all seen those horrible photos of people migrating east because their entire farm is dead and they know that they will starve to death if they can't get somewhere to get food. And they're trying to do that in the midst of the worst economic recession the U.S. has ever hit. In fact, the Great Depression is what we call it. quarter of all Americans lost their jobs overnight. The stock market was wiped out. Billions were wiped out. The U.S. was on its last legs, and there was no one out there to save us because Europe wasn't doing any better, and no one else was either, right? Of course, if you offer $8,000 to $10,000 worth of food in the middle of that, everyone's showing up because you're doing what God called you to do, and you're feeding everybody. You're feeding the starving. Luckily enough, that is not the current situation in Nebraska. Are there hungry people? Yes. Are there starving people? Yes, like there is everywhere. But it's not the Great Depression level numbers. And thank God for that, right? And so after long conversations, we realized there would be much better things we could do with the 8,000 to 10,000 that we might be able to raise for this thing. That maybe its time had come and had gone, but it wasn't a failure. See, that's what everyone goes to when you talk about closing or ending or whatever. They go to this idea that it is somehow a failure and God is going to judge them, and that is simply untrue. And that is what this whole text is about, is it's not a judgment of failure. It's a judgment of God's glory. There aren't 2,000 starving people in Phelps County, Nebraska, because things are way better than in 1929. Therefore, if you put out the food, you're not going to get as many. And that's not bad. That's not failure. That's a success. The March of Dimes used to fight polio. Who here is old enough to remember that? I'm not. Okay? They don't fight polio. Why? They basically defeated polio. So they went on to something else. That's not a failure, that's success. Nor is the fact that the third year of your blackberry bush's rod is going to be its lowest producing year, and it will go down from there, and therefore after 2 you should cut it. Not because that rod has failed, it's because the rod has done its job. And this is how communities work. We always should be looking at what we're doing. What do we spend our money on? What do we spend our resources on? What are our people doing? What is working? What is not? And when something starts to rev down, you end it. Not because someone failed, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the needs of the world change. And our goal is not to supply programs. Our goal is to supply programs that meet the needs of the world. And if the needs change, so do we as the church. That is the life God called us to. See, the church is not about numbers, not about programs. The church is about meeting needs. Because the church and spirituality is ultimately not about the things you do, but the relationships you have. How do we relate to others? How do we relate to God? How do we relate to ourselves? And because of that, we have to do our own pruning individually and our own pruning communally, whatever level of community you're looking at. So as you go out today, the question I have for you to ponder, the question I have for you to pray about, is in what things, both individually and community, do you need to prune? And what new life can come from that? Amen.